On a damp spring night, the remote coast of Norway was shrouded in low clouds and light rain. High above, a de Havilland Canada turboprop aircraft was carrying out its second flight of the day. At about 8 nautical miles from the airport, the crew expected to break through the clouds, spot the runway lights, and land safely. But 36 lives were lost on a mountain known as Karlstad. The sound of impact echoed amid the trees. Brief flashes of fire pierced through the mist before the darkness consumed everything. What caused this tragedy? Let us step into the story of Widerøe Flight 710. Before the cockpit door was reinforced, and before the sterile cockpit rule was written into regulations, Norway's experienced pilots often flew through fjords and island chains, operating routes they called milk runs. These routes would land in every town with a paved runway. Such work required pilots to have determination and the ability to react on the spot. In 1985, Widerøe Airlines introduced the larger de Havilland Canada DHC-7, a 49-seat, 4-engine short takeoff and landing aircraft. It brought greater capacity and a quieter cabin, but it also demanded stricter discipline, absolute adherence to instrument procedures, thorough cross-checks, and a cockpit culture free from distractions. On May 6, 1988, Flight 710 took off from Trondheim after a 90-minute delay, heading north toward Bodø, with scheduled stops at Sandnessjøen Airport, Brønnøysund Airport, and Stokmarknes Est's Skagen Airport. There were 52 people on board, a fully loaded flight, though the number would gradually decrease after each stop. Founded in 1934, Widerøe was known as Norway's air mail carrier. Its crews were famous for quick thinking, and when the weather turned bad, pilots would drop beneath the clouds, using familiar ridges to line up with the runway, landing on narrow strips between sea and mountains. However, the new DHC model was equipped with a more modern, more advanced cockpit and came with strict operational limitations. The aircraft involved in today's accident was registered as LNWFN. By 1988, it had accumulated 16,000 flight hours. Just 3 weeks earlier, it had passed inspection. Its 4 Pratt & Whitney engines were in good condition, and the avionics had recently been calibrated, providing the crew with a strong safety margin. The captain for this flight was 58 years old, with nearly 20,000 flight hours, though only 3,000 of those were on the DHC-7. Seated beside him was the 31-year-old first officer, with 6,500 hours of flying experience, but fewer than 90 hours on the DHC-7. Also on board was a single flight attendant. Since the aircraft was fully loaded on its first leg, following a common practice at the time, a paying passenger was invited to sit in the cockpit jump seat. But this decision would later prove to have a negative impact on the flight. The first leg from Trondheim to Namsos lasted less than 20 minutes. Flight 710 landed smoothly, and 16 of the 49 passengers disembarked, leaving empty seats in the cabin. However, the passenger in the jump seat chose to remain in the cockpit. At 20:07 local time, Flight 710 took off again, heading northwest. The aircraft began a gradual descent and then leveled off, and at 20:13, the crew requested a climb to 9,000 feet. Trondheim Area Control Center approved their climb to that altitude. The atmosphere in the cockpit was relaxed. The captain was flying the aircraft, the first officer handled the radio, while the curious passenger asked questions about throttle settings and fuel. The first officer focused on communications with ATC, but also engaged in frequent conversation with the passenger. The captain, meanwhile, was happy to answer the passenger's questions. However, the cruise phase of the second leg lasted only 15 minutes, leaving the pilots with very little time to prepare for descent. At 20:16, the first officer used the second radio to contact the company operations center, informing them that arrival was expected at 20:32, just 16 minutes later. The passenger in the jump seat continued to talk with the crew from time to time, even as they got closer to their destination. Under today's sterile cockpit rules, such conversations should have been postponed. In fact, as early as 1981, sterile cockpit regulations for critical phases of flight had already been introduced. However, at that time, worldwide and across airlines, enforcement of this rule was still relatively lax. The purpose of the regulation was to prevent distractions during critical phases of flight. Some airlines required it below 18,000 feet, while others implemented it starting from the pre-descent checks. At 2020 local time, the crew of Flight 710 informed air traffic control that they were beginning their descent, and at 2022 requested to be handed over to San Nacion Flight Information Service. The communicating pilot advised the controller that the aircraft was 25 kilometers from the airport at an altitude of 8,000 feet. The controller replied that no other aircraft were using the area, runway 22 was available for landing, southeast wind at 5 knots, visibility 5 nautical miles with light showers. Afterwards, the first officer contacted the company operations center again, requesting a taxi for passengers who might miss their connecting ferry. This call lasted 62 seconds. The captain then began discussing the descent procedures. By 2024, the captain requested to perform the descent checklist. The seatbelt sign in the cockpit was turned on. The captain then announced that after passing the Karlstad waypoint, they would descend to 1,500 feet, then to 550 feet, and finally turn right to land on runway 22. However, Karlstad was not an official waypoint. According to the published approach procedure, the aircraft must maintain 2,500 feet until reaching a new marker called Laka before descending stepwise. The captain relied on a local shortcut he knew well, which depended on visual references. But in the clouds, these references did not exist. At approximately 2027 local time, the aircraft passed the final approach fix at an altitude of only 1,600 feet, already 400 feet below the charted altitude. The airport ordered the landing gear down and the flaps extended. With the increased drag, the aircraft nose lifted slightly. The speed slowed, and then it began to sink again slowly. No pilot provided a verbal warning about the deviation, nor did anyone cross-check altitude against distance. The landing gear was confirmed down and locked. At that moment, the passenger asked the captain how the backup system would operate if the gear failed to deploy properly. The aircraft continued its descent to 550 feet, with the autopilot maintaining about 560 feet. At this point, they were 8 nautical miles from the runway threshold, but only 560 feet of altitude remained between them and the ground. When air traffic control asked for their position, the first officer replied, 8 nautical miles. In that instant, the gap between perception and reality became completely fixed. If the aircraft really were 8 nautical miles out, an altitude of 1,500 feet would have been appropriate. But the instruments showed only 560 feet. The controller then reported updated wind direction and speed. The first officer adjusted, and the aircraft continued on approach. Everything in the cabin appeared normal, and outside the window was still a blur of clouds. Everyone hoped to break through the clouds soon and see the ground. At 2028, the passenger in the jump seat again engaged the captain in casual conversation. The captain responded politely, then ordered flaps to 25 degrees and full spoiler retraction. At 2029, the landing checklist was completed. Seconds later, the terrain warning system detected rising terrain and issued a high-pitched continuous alert. Almost simultaneously, all 4 engines increased thrust and the nose pitched up 6 degrees. A dark mountain wall suddenly emerged from the clouds. At 2029, the aircraft first struck the mountain with the tip of its right wing, followed immediately by the rest of the fuselage. At that moment, all 36 people on board were killed. Shortly after the crash, fire trucks were dispatched, their blue lights flashing. In the southern fields of Norway, a Royal Air Force Sea King helicopter took off for rescue, but due to low clouds and weather conditions, it could only hover over the area until daybreak. Volunteers and rescue workers climbed along narrow mountain roads, finally reaching the wreckage around midnight. At 23:30 local time, authorities announced that there were no survivors. At dawn, Karlstad was still shrouded in thick fog, but a dark scar was clearly visible on the mountain. 75 Home Guard soldiers established a security perimeter, while investigators from the Norwegian Accident Investigation Board set up a temporary laboratory at the airport facility. Both black boxes were intact and sent to Fosca for analysis. Data analysis showed that the aircraft remained fully controllable throughout the flight. The engines continued to produce power until impact, and the crew followed all standard procedures. Under the crew's control, the aircraft flew precisely in the wrong direction, striking the rising terrain head-on. Why did two qualified pilots lose altitude prematurely? The answer: they started descending 4 nautical miles too early. According to procedure, the aircraft should have begun descending from 1,600 feet at 4 nautical miles from the runway. Instead, on this flight, they began their descent 8 nautical miles out. The investigation into the Widerøe crew revealed an informal flight culture, including habitual approach of cockpit visitors and casual conversations during critical flight phases. Training records showed that during DHC-7 conversion training, no simulator sessions were scheduled. The pilot's instrument training was mostly conducted on the actual aircraft and usually during daylight hours. Aeronautical charts contained outdated navigation beacon information and lacked clear vertical profile diagrams. Mutual monitoring between the captain and first officer, call and response procedures, and attitude cross-checks were largely paper-based rather than strictly practiced daily. The investigation committee found multiple errors in Widerøe's routes, which could have contributed to the accident. For example, a decommissioned outer beacon remained on the route charts. Vertical flight profiles from the Laka beacon were not depicted. Altitude restrictions in the accident area were only noted textually, not shown graphically. Confusion existed regarding the timing for final approach discrimination. The committee also criticized the airline's checklist procedures, which required pilots to tune a radio to the company frequency during descent exactly when unrelated communications were least needed for safety. The committee could not pinpoint the exact moment when the crew misjudged, but they identified the interwoven factors behind the accident: distractions, lax procedures, ambiguous documentation, and organizational cultural gaps. The final report, released in August 1989, attributed the accident to a premature descent for unknown reasons and made a series of comprehensive recommendations, including strict enforcement of sterile cockpit rules, correction of route charts, raising the minimum flight altitude near Karlstad, increased use of simulator training, and full implementation of crew resource management on every flight. Flight 710 was the second of 4 fatal accidents experienced by Widerøe Airlines between 1982 and 1993. Each accident forced the airline to gradually move toward modern safety management. By the mid-1990s, Widerøe had installed 4 full-motion simulators for its DHC-7 fleet, mandated sterile cockpit rules, and integrated crew resource management into all recurrent training programs. Brønnøysund Airport later installed a satellite-based landing system, providing pilots with vertical guidance, a technology that would almost certainly have prevented the tragedy of Flight 710. Today, climbers ascend the famous Karlstad area, stopping in front of a simple monument engraved with the names of the 36 victims. Every May, relatives gather there to hold memorial services, and Widerøe crews also attend. Though they never knew the victims personally, they remember the lessons of each flight. On the 25th anniversary of the crash, a retired officer reminded investigators that the passenger in the jump seat had carried a brick-sized mobile phone, whose 15-watt transmission power could potentially cause electromagnetic interference in the cockpit. Engineers subsequently tested the DHC-7's avionics under extreme conditions and found no measurable effect on the navigation receivers. It was ultimately confirmed that the reason Flight 710 descended below the safe altitude was not radio signals, but human factors. In early aviation, the margin between routine flight and disaster was often measured in just seconds and feet. Flight 710 serves as a reminder that experience can breed overconfidence, and an unverified assumption can override even the most advanced technology. Distraction, no matter how well-intentioned, can be fatal. We still do not know why the crew began their descent 8 nautical miles from the runway, instead of following procedure and starting at 4 nautical miles. I believe this was simply an oversight that any pilot or air traffic controller could have detected and corrected in time. But due to a lax safety culture, these simple yet critical checks were overlooked.